Daniel Wright stood in the massive council chamber and felt his hands shake with anger as he read the document on his screen, and the giant hall was filled with thousands of alien beings from every corner of the galaxy. But right now, he only cared about the words in front of him that demanded humanity give up most of their ships and let the council control their colonies. And this was not a negotiation, but an order dressed up as a request. And he had spent 15 years as a diplomat, learning to stay calm and find compromise. But this was different because they were not trying to work with humanity, but trying to cage them like dangerous animals. The speaker of the council was a creature made of living crystal named Theron, who stood 3 times taller than any human, and his body reflected light in ways that hurt to look at directly, and his voice came through the translation system, sounding cold and distant, as he explained that humanity had grown too fast, and built too many colonies, and created too much technology in too short a time, and therefore, they were dangerous to the established order of things. And Daniel wanted to laugh at the absurdity, because humanity had followed every rule, and respected every boundary, and helped other species whenever asked. But none of that mattered, because the real crime was being good at survival and progress. Lisa Hayes stood beside Daniel, and she was a commander in the human fleet, but wore civilian clothes for this diplomatic meeting, and her face stayed neutral, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know because she had seen this coming for months, and warned him that the council powers were getting nervous about human expansion, and now her predictions were coming true in the worst possible way, and Daniel knew that whatever he said next would change everything for humanity, and there would be no going back from this moment. Ambassador Kelrix from the Heptan Consortium spoke next, and his body was like a blob of thick liquid that rippled when he moved, and his translated voice dripped with false concern as he explained that humanity needed protection from themselves, and that the council would provide security and guidance and oversight, and all humanity had to do was surrender their independence and accept their place in the galactic order. And Daniel felt something break inside him because he realized they actually believed humans would accept this without question. Daniel took a deep breath and looked at the assembled aliens and spoke with a voice that carried across the enormous chamber because he wanted everyone to hear what came next. And he said the council was not asking for cooperation, but demanding submission. And this was not about security but about control. And the council powers were afraid of competition and saw humanity as a threat to their comfortable dominance. And he watched as the chamber erupted in noise with some aliens agreeing and others shouting in outrage. But he did not care anymore, because the truth needed to be spoken. Theron tried to restore order, and his crystal body pulsed with colors that the translation system said meant anger and authority. And he declared that humanity had 6 days to accept the terms or face sanctions and blockades and isolation from galactic trade, and Daniel felt the weight of that threat because it could hurt human colonies badly and cause suffering for millions of people. But then he looked at Lisa again and saw her slight nod and knew what had to be done. Because some prices were too high to pay, even for peace and comfort. Daniel reached down and gathered his papers and files and began shutting down his connection to the council systems, and the other human diplomats behind him understood immediately and started doing the same thing, and the aliens, in the a chamber grew confused. Because this was not normal protocol. And no species had ever just walked away from a council session before. And Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him as he made the choice that would define his career and maybe his entire life. Theron demanded to know what Daniel was doing, and his voice carried warning and threat in equal measure, and Daniel looked up at the crystal being and smiled without warmth and explained that humanity was leaving because there was nothing more to discuss, and the council had made their position clear, and humanity rejected it completely, and they would not stay to be bullied or threatened into giving up their freedom. Kelrix made his gelatinous body shake with what might have been shock or disbelief, and asked if humanity would really abandon all the benefits of council membership over pride. And Lisa stepped forward before Daniel could answer, and Herminder. The voice was hard as steel when she said, this was not about pride but about dignity, and humanity did not claw their way up from one planet and survive world wars and build colonies across the stars just to bow down to aliens who were too comfortable to accept equals. The chamber descended into chaos with hundreds of species all talking at once and translation systems overloading from the sheer volume of noise. And Daniel led the human delegation toward the massive doors, and none of them looked back, and he activated his communicator and bypassed the council network to reach the human fleet, waiting in orbit around the station. And he told Captain Paul Bennett to prepare all ships for immediate departure and to be ready for anything. Paul's voice came back steady and professional, asking if they should expect trouble, and Daniel paused at the doorway and looked back one last time at the council chamber where aliens were shouting and arguing and panicking because something unprecedented was happening, and he told Paul that trouble depended on whether the council was as foolish as they were arrogant, but to assume the worst and prepare accordingly. The doors sealed behind the human delegation and cut off the noise from the chamber, and Lisa walked beside Daniel through the corridor and said quietly that this would have consequences, and Daniel agreed, but said that sometimes the cost of keeping dignity was cheaper than the cost of wearing chains, and they both knew that the easy path would have been to negotiate and compromise and gradually surrender pieces of humanity's independence. But that path led to slow death of the spirit. The human delegation reached their shuttle and began boarding, and Daniel took one last look at the massive council station floating in space and wondered if they had just prevented a future war or started one, and he did not have an answer, but knew they had made the only choice that let them look their children in the eye and say they stood up when it mattered and refused to kneel. As the shuttle pulled away from the station, Daniel watched through the viewport as the council station grew smaller, and he thought about all the work that had gone into building relationships with alien species and all the diplomatic bridges that were burning behind them. And he felt a moment of doubt, but then remembered the contempt in Kelrix's voice and the cold certainty in Theron's demands, and knew that those bridges had been built on false foundations. Anyway, the shuttle docked with the Lincoln Station, where Captain Paul Bennett was coordinating the departure of over 200 human ships, and the mood was tense but determined, and every crew member knew they were part of something historic and possibly dangerous. And Daniel addressed them through the ship's communication system and told them they were going home as free people, and whatever came next, they would face it together. And the response was immediate, with crews across the fleet expressing support and readiness. Paul showed Daniel the tactical display where multiple alien fleets were beginning to move and position themselves. And Lisa studied the patterns and said it looked like someone was planning to block their exit, and Daniel felt his stomach tighten because he had hoped the council would let them leave peacefully, but apparently some factions wanted to force the issue and prove their dominance. Daniel asked Paul what their chances were if it came to a fight, and Paul was quiet for a moment before explaining that human ships had better weapons and shields than most of the council fleets knew about, but they were still outnumbered 5-1, and a battle would be costly even if they won, and Daniel nodded and said they would try to avoid fighting, but would not surrender, and Paul smiled grimly and said that was what he expected to hear. The hours that followed were tense as the human fleet organized itself for departure and moved toward their planned jump coordinates, and sensors tracked multiple alien fleets shadowing their movements. And Daniel wondered which side would blink first, and whether they could really pull off a peaceful departure, or if blood would be spilled before they reached human space, and he prepared himself for both possibilities. Captain Paul Bennett watched his tactical display with growing concern as it showed 237 human ships spread across the space around the council station, and each ship was a dot of light on his screen representing hundreds or thousands of crew members who trusted him to get them home safely. And he had been in the fleet for 20 years, but had never faced a situation quite like this, where they were leaving peacefully but preparing for war. Lieutenant Kyle Murphy called out from his station that civilian ships were almost ready, with 85% reporting full departure readiness and the rest just finishing cargo checks and securing loose equipment, and Paul nodded, because he wanted every ship ready to jump at the same moment so nobody got left behind if trouble started, and he knew from experience that waiting for stragglers could turn a controlled retreat into a disaster. Commander Rachel Stone sat at the weapons console, and her fingers moved constantly across her controls, bringing defensive systems online, and checking firing solutions. And Paul trusted her completely, because she had proven herself in a dozen pirate encounters where quick thinking saved lives, and she understood that the best way to avoid a fight was to be completely ready for one. The communication console chimed, and Lieutenant Greg Palmer announced they were being hailed by multiple sources, and the Karathi fleet commander wanted to speak, and Paul felt his pulse quicken, because the Karathi were one of the most powerful military forces in Council space, and if they wanted to block the human departure, things could get very bad very quickly. The view screen activated and showed Fleet Commander Zorith, whose reptilian features looked dangerous even through the distortion of the communication system, and the Karathi were known across the galaxy as warriors who had conquered dozens of worlds before joining the Council centuries ago, and their military tradition was old and respected, and facing them in battle was something most species avoided. Zorith spoke with his translator, turning his hissing speech into words Paul could understand, and he said, "The human departure was premature, and the Council had not dismissed them, and they should return to the station for further discussion." And Paul kept his face neutral because he could hear something in Zorith's tone that did not match his words, and it sounded almost like warning rather than threat. Paul replied that Ambassador Wright had determined further discussion was pointless, and humanity was exercising their right to leave peacefully, and they were not asking permission but simply informing the Council of their decision, and Zorith was quiet for a moment before saying the situation was more complex than humans understood, and there were factions who saw this departure as an opportunity. That got Paul's full attention, and he asked Zorith to explain, and the Karathi commander glanced to his side as if checking whether anyone was listening, and then said quietly that not everyone on the Council supported the ultimatum given to humanity, and some had warned this would push humans too far. But others saw conflict as beneficial, because it would either eliminate a competitor or justify a united military response. Paul felt cold, understanding wash over him because he realized the Council hardliners had set up a situation where they won, regardless of outcome, and if humans stayed, they were controlled, and if they left peacefully, the hardliners lost influence, but if they left violently, it proved humans were dangerous and needed to be crushed, and the whole thing was a trap designed to force humanity into a no-win scenario. Zorith continued speaking and said that humanity was not the only species tired of Council restrictions, and the Karathi remembered when they stood alone and answered to nobody, and watching humans defy the Council reminded them what sovereignty meant, and Paul understood that Zorith was offering something more than just information, but possibly alliance, or at least neutrality. Kyle suddenly interrupted, saying they had a situation because the Heptan fleet was moving to intercept their convoy route and positioning to block their jump coordinates, and Paul pulled up the tactical display and saw dozens of Heptan warships spreading out to cover every exit vector the human fleet might use. And he knew this was the confrontation everyone had feared. Zorith saw it too, and his eyes narrowed, and he told Paul that the Heptan commander was ambitious and foolish, and believed he could force human compliance with minimal force, but was badly wrong, and Paul asked if Zorith was offering help, and the Karathi commander was quiet before saying he was offering advice, and that advice was to not fire first, but if fired upon to not hold back. Because the Council needed to understand that threatening humanity had real costs. The transmission ended, and Paul was left staring at a blank screen, while his bridge crew waited for orders, and he knew the next few minutes would determine whether humanity went home peacefully or started a war that could spread across the forced galaxy, and he had no good options, only degrees of risk. Paul ordered all ships to alter course to alternate jump coordinates, but Greg reported that the Heptans were blocking those routes too, and they had spread their fleet to cover all the primary exit vectors, and Paul realized they were being deliberately trapped and forced into either surrender or conflict. He opened a channel to the Heptan fleet, and his voice was calm, but carried unmistakable authority, as he told them they were blocking a peaceful departure, and needed to stand aside, and the response came from Admiral Pelksith, whose gelatinous form rippled with satisfaction, as he said, human vessels would hold position, and await Council security forces to escort them back. Paul interrupted before Pelksith could finish and said, humanity was not asking permission but informing them of intent, and they were leaving, and the Heptans could stand aside, or be moved aside. and Pelxith's form darkened with anger as he asked if Paul dared threaten a council fleet with his 24 military vessels against 80 heptan warships. Paul smiled without warmth and told Rachel to light them up, and every human military ship simultaneously activated their targeting systems and painted every heptan vessel with targeting lasers and fire control radar and sensor locks, and the heptan fleet's computers started screaming warnings about incoming threat detection. Rachel reported with grim satisfaction that the heptans were reading their weapons signatures, and based on communication chatter, they were realizing human railguns had triple the range and 4 times the penetration power of anything they had faced before, and their formations were wavering, as individual ship commanders understood they were facing technology far more advanced than expected. Paul reopened the channel to Pelxith and explained calmly that heptan shields were designed to stop plasma weapons and conventional missiles. But human kinetic penetrators would punch through them like they were not there, and each human destroyer carried enough firepower to cripple 4 heptan cruisers, and their battleships could engage the entire heptan fleet simultaneously. He let that sink in before continuing, and said this was not a bluff, but physics and mathematics. And if Pelxith forced the issue, then yes, the humans might eventually be stopped by sheer numbers, but the heptan fleet would cease to exist in the process and was maintaining council dominance worth dying for. The silence stretched for 30 seconds, while Pelxith calculated odds and consulted with his officers, and Paul watched his tactical display, where several heptan ships were already beginning to drift backward, and their formation was breaking as individual commanders decided they did not want to be the first to test human weapons. Finally, the heptan ships began moving aside and creating a corridor through their formation, and Pelxith's voice came back saying, "Humanity had made an enemy today," and Paul replied quietly that no, the heptans made an enemy when they tried to cage humans, and humanity was just refusing to cooperate. The human fleet began moving through the heptan formation with every sensor active and every weapon ready, and crews at full alert, because they were not safe until they jumped, and Paul knew that any moment, someone on the heptan side might panic and fire, and then everything would explode into violence. Kyle called out with surprise in his voice, saying that other fleets were repositioning, and the Korathi were opening a corridor, and so were the Talros and the Vrex Union, and they were not blocking humanity but facilitating their departure. And Paul realized that Zorith had been right about other species watching and waiting to see how this played out. Rachel leaned back in her chair and said quietly that they were not the only ones tired of council control, and Paul agreed while keeping his eyes on the tactical display as the human fleet cleared the heptan formation and accelerated toward their jump coordinates. Paul broadcast to the entire fleet, telling all ships to prepare for jump in 3 minutes and to maintain formation and stay alert until they were safely in human space, and the acknowledgments came back quickly with every captain reporting readiness. As the countdown proceeded, Paul allowed himself a moment to think about what they had just done, and humanity had defied the most powerful political organization in the galaxy, and backed it up with credible threat of force, and won without firing a shot, but the victory felt fragile because he knew this was just the beginning. The jump drives spun up and space began to distort around each ship as exotic matter fields bent reality and prepared to throw them across light years in an instant. And Paul watched his countdown timer tick toward 0. At 0, the entire human fleet jumped simultaneously, and 237 ships vanished from council space in flashes of twisted light, and left behind a political situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. Paul knew they would make it home and crews would celebrate and call it a victory, but he also knew this was not over because the council would have to respond somehow, and humanity had just challenged the established order in a way that could not be ignored. The Lincoln Station emerged from jump space in the outer solar system, and Paul looked at the blue-green dot that was Earth in the distance, and felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, because they were home, but the galaxy would never see humanity the same way again, and the question was, what came next? The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been running continuously for 3 days, and Speaker Theron's crystalline body had lost its usual bright shimmer and looked dull and stressed in a way that most species had never witnessed before, and the chamber was filled with angry voices and accusation and fear as thousands of delegates tried to process what humanity had done. Ambassador Kelrix stood in the heptan section, and his gelatinous form rippled violently as he shouted that the humans had threatened a council fleet, and this was an act of war that demanded immediate military response, and his voice carried rage and humiliation because his cousin Pelxith had been forced to back down, and the entire heptan consortium felt the shame of it. Commander Zorith replied from the Korathi section, with a calm voice that cut through the noise, and he said that Pelxith's fleet had blocked a peaceful departure, and the humans had every right to defend their convoy, and there was no law that required species to ask permission to leave council space, and everything humanity did was legal, even if it was uncomfortable. Kelrix turned his anger toward Zorith, and accused him of defending humanity and betraying the council. And Zorith's reptilian eyes narrowed, as he replied that he was acknowledging reality, not picking sides. And the reality was that humanity had been prepared for both peace and war, and the council had underestimated them badly. Theron tried to restore order by raising his voice and saying that regardless of legality, they had a crisis, because humanity had rejected council authority, and if this stood without response, it would set a precedent that could destroy everything the council had built over 12,000 years. In the human embassy section of the station, Daniel Wright sat with Lisa Hayes and 3 other senior staff members watching the council session through secure channels, and despite the fleet's departure, the embassy had not been evacuated because Daniel wanted to maintain some presence and keep communication lines open even if official relations were frozen. Lisa observed that the council was panicking, and she did not think they had ever expected humanity to actually walk away. And Daniel agreed while pulling up data from Earth, where Commerce Secretary Martin Cole reported that the human economy was stabilizing faster than projected without council trade restrictions. Dr. Helen Pierce, who handled economic analysis, explained that council trade agreements had been structured to benefit established powers, and humanity had been paying high prices for raw materials while selling manufactured goods at artificially low rates, and without those restrictions, human colonies could trade directly with independent systems and actually make better profits. Commander Jake Torres, who liaised with military intelligence, reported that 15 independent systems had reached out through back channels, expressing interest in trade agreements, and the Vrex Union had made it official by requesting a formal alliance. And Daniel leaned back, processing this information. Daniel noted that the Vrex had been conquered by the Heptan Consortium 2 centuries ago and forced into council membership against their will, and they had wanted independence ever since, but lacked the strength to achieve it alone. And Lisa finished his thought by saying they now saw their chance, because humanity had proven that defying the council was possible. A priority transmission came through, and Admiral Christine Wade appeared as a hologram, and she was the head of Earth's Stellar Defense Force, and her uniform was crisp, and her bearing was pure military, as she reported that humanity had mobilized additional fleets, and positioned them at the border with council space. Daniel asked how many ships they were talking about, and Christine replied, 400 combat vessels currently operational, with another 200 that could be activated from reserve status within 2 weeks, and the new Dreadnought class ships would add significant firepower, with the first one operational within 3 months. Lisa whistled quietly and said the council had no idea how strong the human military actually was. And Christine smiled grimly and explained that the council had made assumptions based on the number of vessels humanity showed them, but did not know about reserve fleets or rapid construction capabilities, or the fact that human weapons technology was 2 generations ahead of anything else in council space. Daniel asked if they should reveal their full capabilities, and Christine said that was a political decision. But from a military standpoint, she recommended a demonstration to let the council see what they were dealing with before someone did something stupid that could not be taken back. After Christine signed off, the group sat quietly thinking, and Jake finally said that the council was used to dealing with species that had relatively static military capabilities, and they did not understand how fast humans could innovate and adapt and build. Helen added that it was more than technology, and most council species were risk-averse by nature, and they assumed humans would back down under pressure because that was what everyone else did, and they could not comprehend a species that would choose conflict over submission. Lisa said thoughtfully that humans evolved as persistence hunters and literally built to keep coming regardless of odds or obstacles. And it was coded into human DNA at a fundamental level. And the council had no framework for understanding that kind of stubbornness. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the massive council station floating in space, and said, maybe it was time to make that clear, and not as a threat, but as simple fact. And if the council wanted peace with humanity, it would be as equals, or not at all. He turned back to his team and told them to set up a transmission that would address the council in their next emergency session, and to gather everything available on historical Earth conflicts with specific examples of what happened when humans were pushed too far, and he wanted the galaxy to understand what they were dealing with. Meanwhile, across council space, the human departure was causing unexpected ripples, and on the trade hub of Keltris Prime, merchants were discovering that human goods were not just desirable but essential for certain manufacturing processes. And the sudden supply cut was causing economic problems that were spreading through multiple sectors. On frontier colonies that the council had long neglected, local governors were quietly reaching out to human representatives, asking about protection agreements because the human fleet's handling of the Heptan blockade had impressed them more than anything the council had done in decades. In military academies across dozens of species, instructors were pulling up every available recording of human military actions and analyzing tactics and technology and doctrine with new urgency because they realized their previous assessments had been dangerously incomplete. In the Korathi Fleet Command Center, Zorith met with his fellow officers and explained that humans had discipline and technology, but most importantly, they had something the Korathi lost when they joined the council thousands of years ago. And that was the will to stand alone and accept the consequences. His second-in-command observed that Zorith admired humanity, and Zorith corrected him, saying he respected them, and there was a difference, and the council made a catastrophic mistake by trying to contain humanity, rather than court them as true partners. The second asked what the Korathi would do if war came, and Zorith's eyes gleamed, as he said they would watch and learn, and decide whether they stood with the council that had constrained them for millennia, or with the species that dared to walk away from power, rather than submit to it. Back in the council chamber, Theron finally managed to restore some order, and declared they had to make a decision about whether to accept human departure and negotiate a new relationship, or enforce council authority through military sacks. Action. Kelrix immediately demanded military action, saying anything less showed weakness, and would encourage others to defy the council. And Zorith countered that anything else showed tyranny. And the humans broke no laws, but simply refused to be threatened, and was that now a crime worthy of war? The debate continued for hours, with the council deeply divided between those who wanted to force humanity back into compliance, and those who recognized that attempting to do so would cost more than any possible benefit, and a third faction was emerging that saw this as an opportunity to reform the council itself. Several smaller species spoke up, saying they had remained silent for too long, while the council became more about control than cooperation, and they thanked humanity for having the courage to stand up, because it gave others permission to speak. And suddenly, the emergency session was not just about humanity, but about the fundamental nature of what the council should be. Theron watched his carefully ordered galaxy unravel in real time, as species that had been quietly resentful for centuries suddenly found their voices and allies, and he realized that humanity had not just defied the council but had accidentally sparked something much larger and more dangerous to the established order. The question was no longer whether the council would go to war with humanity, but whether the council would survive in its current form at all. And Theron understood that the next few weeks would determine the shape of galactic politics for the next 1,000 years. 3 weeks after the human fleet departed from council space, every communication system across the galaxy received an unexpected transmission that broadcast on all standard diplomatic channels, but more importantly, also went out on public frequencies that anyone with basic equipment could receive, and billions of beings across thousands of worlds tuned in to see what humanity would say. The image showed Ambassador Daniel Wright, but he was not in a diplomatic office or conference room, but standing on what was clearly a military vessel's bridge. And behind him, through a large viewport, dozens of human warships hung in. formation like a steel warning, and his expression was calm, but his voice carried unmistakable authority. Daniel introduced himself and explained that he had been humanity's ambassador to the Council until 3 weeks ago, but was speaking now, not as a diplomat, but as a representative of a free species that had been forced to make a choice. And he said the Council had portrayed humanity as aggressive and dangerous, but everyone knew this was about control, not security. Behind him, the viewport shifted to show data streams and images, as Daniel explained that Council trade agreements extracted wealth from independent systems, and their security forces only responded to threats when it served major power. Interests, and their laws, were enforced selectively, with strict application, against the weak and loose interpretation for the strong. In the council chamber, where an emergency session was watching the transmission, Ambassador Kelrix shouted that this was outrageous and demanded they cut the broadcast. But technicians reported frantically that it was transmitting on too many frequencies, and shutting it down would require disabling half the communications infrastructure across council space. Daniel's voice continued, saying that humanity was not anyone's enemy and never had been, but they refused to trade freedom for the illusion of security, and they were not naive about consequences, so he wanted to be absolutely clear about where humanity stood. The display behind him changed to show an impressive military formation of hundreds of human vessels, organized in precise patterns with weapons systems that gleamed in starlight. And Daniel identified this as the Home Defense Fleet, with 412 warships dedicated to protecting human space and allied systems. The image shifted again, showing massive shipyards in orbit around Earth and Mars, and several colony worlds, and in each yard dozens of vessels were under construction in various stages of completion, and Daniel explained that humanity could build a warship from start to finish in 8 weeks, and at full industrial mobilization, could produce 50 combat vessels per month. In military command centers across Council space, analysts frantically ran calculations, and the numbers Daniel presented were staggering because most species needed years to build a single warship, and the idea of producing 50 per month was beyond anything they had conceived possible. Daniel continued, saying that human technology advanced not in millennia or even centuries, but in years and decades, and their weapons were designed for threats that did not exist yet, and their tactics were refined through constant simulation, and their entire species understood what it meant to stand together against existential threats, because they had done it multiple times on their own world. Admiral Christine Wade appeared beside Daniel in the transmission, wearing her crisp uniform and military bearing, and she introduced herself as the commanding officer of humanity's stellar defense forces, and said she wanted to add some specific details to Daniel's statement. Christine explained that human railguns had 3 times the effective range of the best Council plasma cannons, and their point defense systems could track and eliminate thousands of incoming threats simultaneously, and their ships were faster and more maneuverable, and carried more firepower per ton than anything in Council fleets. She gestured, and technical specifications began scrolling across the display, showing weapons data and defensive capabilities and sensor ranges, and Christine emphasized this was not a threat, but information the Council needed to make informed decisions, because if they forced a military confrontation, Council fleets would suffer casualties not seen in galactic warfare for thousands of years. Christine continued in a measured tone, saying that Council shipyards could not replace losses as fast as humans could inflict them, and Council economies could not sustain prolonged conflict with a species that spent its entire existence perfecting the art of warfare and survival. Daniel returned to the center of the transmission, and his expression became more earnest, as he said, humanity was showing this, not because they wanted to use it, but because they wanted the Council to understand the real costs of forcing them to use it, and they genuinely wanted peace and cooperation and the chance to trade and learn and grow alongside other species. He said humanity just refused to do it in chains, and the transmission showed Earth itself hanging in space as a blue marble. And Daniel explained this was their home, and they had fought for it, and died for it, and rebuilt from disasters more times than many species had recorded in their histories. Daniel took a visible breath, and said the choice was the Council's to make, and they could negotiate with humanity as equals, or fight them as enemies. But if they chose war, humanity would not surrender or submit or stop until either they won their freedom or went extinct, and there was no middle ground. He said they would await the council's decision and gave them 30 days before the transmission ended, leaving billions of viewers across the galaxy in shocked silence. And in the council chamber, chaos erupted immediately, with delegates shouting over each other, demanding military response or counseling caution or proposing compromise. Speaker Theron's voice cut through the noise, declaring this was an ultimatum. And Commander Zorith replied calmly from the Korathi section, saying, "No. This was information, and the humans had told everyone exactly what would happen under each scenario, and that was more honesty than the council had shown them." Kelrix demanded to know if Zorith was defending humanity, and Zorith said he was acknowledging reality. And the reality was that humans had prepared for both peace and war, and made their preparations public. So every system in the galaxy now knew the council either accepted humanity as equals or went to war with a species that had been preparing for exactly this scenario since they first left their homeworld. In the Vrex Union ruling council, Chairman Vex Prime spoke carefully, saying the humans had given them an opportunity, and if the council went to war with humanity, they needed to decide where they stood, and his military advisor replied that they should stand with those who respected their sovereignty because the council conquered them, but humans offered alliance as equals. Across council space, similar conversations were happening in government chambers and military headquarters and trading posts, as independent systems and minor powers, and even some major council members, quietly reassessed their positions, and the human transmission had not just been directed at council leadership, but was a direct appeal to the galactic public. On Earth, in the Stellar Defense Command Center, Admiral Christine met with her senior staff and asked for analysis, and General Marcus Flynn, who headed strategic planning, pulled up holographic displays and said the transmission achieved multiple objectives. Marcus explained they had established deterrence, so the council knew what fighting would cost, and they had created internal divisions within the council, because at least a third of members were now questioning whether confrontation was worth it, and they had positioned humanity as the reasonable party seeking peace. Intelligence Director Nina Clark added that most importantly, they had bought time because 30 days meant the council had to debate and argue and try to reach consensus, and every day that passed, more systems would start questioning council authority and wondering if independence was possible. Christine asked what would happen if the council chose war anyway, and Marcus replied grimly that they would be ready with defensive operations fully deployed and offensive operations prepared to launch on her command. And he hesitated, before mentioning their most extreme contingency plan, saying it should only be used if they truly had no other choice. Christine said quietly that she hoped it would not come to that, but ordered all operations maintained at full readiness. And as the meeting ended, she looked at the strategic display showing human space and the vast territory beyond where the council controlled thousands of systems. She wondered if the council leadership understood that humanity was not bluffing, and this was not posturing but a simple statement of fact, and humans would fight if forced to fight, and they would not stop until they won or died, because that was what humans did when their survival was threatened. The next 30 days would determine whether the galaxy moved toward cooperation or catastrophe, and everyone on all sides knew the decisions made would be written in history books of every species, and the question was whether those books would tell a story of wisdom or tragedy. 28 days after humanity's ultimatum, Speaker Theron stood before a council assembly that looked nothing like the confident, unified body that had confronted humanity. And the chamber was divided and tense, and for the first time, in thousands of years, genuinely uncertain about the path forward. Theron announced that voting would now commence on the human question, and 3 options were before the council, which were full military action, to enforce authority or acceptance of humanity's demands for equal status, or a negotiated middle ground, and his crystalline form reflected the anxiety that filled the massive chamber. Ambassador Kelrix rose immediately and declared the Heptan Consortium voted for military action, because weakness now would invite chaos later, and his gelatinous form rippled with anger and wounded pride over the humiliation his forces had suffered. But an unexpected voice followed, as Commander Zorith announced the Korathi Empire abstained from military action and wished to make a statement before voting continued, and the chamber fell silent because the Korathi were one of the most powerful military forces in council space. Zorith spoke about how the Korathi were once conquerors, who built an empire through strength and held it through discipline. And when they joined the Council, 3,000 years ago, it was because they chose cooperation over endless conflict, not because they were forced. He said humanity reminded the Korathi of what they once were, which was strong and proud and unwilling to bend. And the Council had forgotten that true unity came from respect, not submission. And if they forced humanity into compliance, they would not create stability but resentment that would fester for generations. Kelrix called Zorith a coward, but the Korathi commander replied calmly that he was a realist who had reviewed human military capabilities in detail and consulted with strategists and historians, and if the Council went to war, they would eventually win because numbers favored them. But the cost would be staggering, with tens of thousands of ships lost, and millions dead, and decades spent rebuilding. Zorith asked what the point was of proving they could force one species to obey, and whether that was worth the price they would pay. And his words hung in the air as delegates considered the implications. Ambassador Trell of the Vrex Union spoke next, saying his people also abstained from military action. And furthermore, they wished to announce they had signed a mutual defense pact with humanity. And if the Council attacked humans, they would be attacking the Vrex as well. The chamber erupted in shocked exclamations, and Speaker Theron demanded to know if the Vrex had really allied with humanity. And Trell replied firmly that they had allied with a species that treated them as equals, which was something the Council failed to do for 200 years. Trell continued, saying the Vrex were tired of being vassals, and if the choice was between Council membership that denied their sovereignty or alliance with humans who respected it, then they chose humanity without hesitation. The voting continued over the next hour, and the results shocked everyone, because the Council was deeply split, with 142 species voting for military action, and 289 voting for negotiated solution, and 94 voting to accept human demands, and 67 abstaining. Theron stared at the results in disbelief, saying this was unprecedented, and the Council had never been this divided on a major decision. And Zorith replied bluntly that the Council was broken, and it broke the moment they tried to cage a species for being competent and independent. In the human embassy, Daniel Wright received the vote tallies and allowed himself a small smile, while Lisa Hayes looked over his shoulder at the data and said quietly that they won, but Daniel corrected her, saying they survived, and now came the hard part of building something better. The negotiations that followed took 3 months, and were often contentious, but ultimately, a new framework emerged that became known as the Treaty of Earth, and it established several revolutionary principles that changed how the galaxy operated. The first principle was that species could choose their level of engagement with the Council, from full membership to associate status to complete independence with trade agreements, and the Council's authority was no longer absolute. The second principle established that military forces would remain under sovereign control, and no species could be required to disarm or submit to Council military oversight. The third principle said trade agreements would be negotiated bilaterally or multilaterally, and not imposed by Council mandate, and the days of enforced economic relationships were over. The fourth principle created a new assembly structure, giving equal voice to smaller powers and limiting the veto authority of major species, so decisions could not be dictated by a handful of dominant civilizations. The changes were revolutionary, and not everyone was happy because the Heptan Consortium withdrew from the Council entirely, along with a handful of other species who saw the new structure as too weak, but their departure was more than compensated by species who now felt they could participate meaningfully. Humanity took full membership under the new structure, and within 6 months had become one of the most active participants in Council affairs, but now as partners rather than suppliants, and their technology and innovation became available through voluntary cooperation rather than forced extraction. 1 year after the confrontation, Daniel stood in the same council chamber where he had walked out, but the atmosphere was completely different, and he was presenting a proposal for a joint human council exploration mission to a newly discovered sector of space. As Daniel finished his presentation, Speaker Theron addressed him directly and said he needed to confess something, which was that when humans walked out, he believed it was the beginning of catastrophe, and he was certain they would go to war. And thousands would die, and the council would fragment beyond repair. Daniel asked what Theron thought now, and the crystalline being said, he realized that walking out was perhaps the bravest and most necessary action Daniel could have taken, because it forced the council to confront truths they had been avoiding for millennia, and the council had become about control, not cooperation. Theron continued, saying humanity reminded everyone what sovereignty meant and why it mattered, and Daniel replied that humanity did not do this to teach a lesson, but because they had no other choice and could not accept a future where their children grew up as second-class members of galactic civilization. Theron said he understood that now, and hoped Daniel understood that the changes that happened would not have been possible without humanity standing up, because others wanted to speak, but lacked the courage or capability, and humans had both. Daniel walked through the station corridors with Lisa after the session, and she said thoughtfully that in a strange way, Kelrix and the hardliners did humanity a favor, because if they had been more subtle and patient in trying to control humans, the restrictions might have been accepted incrementally. Daniel agreed, saying the hardliners got greedy and pushed too hard, too fast, and forgot that you cannot force proud species into submission, but can only drive them to rebellion. And sometimes, the best thing an enemy can do is overplay their hand. They reached the docking bay where a shuttle waited, and Daniel looked back at the massive station one last time. And Lisa asked if he thought this new council would last. And Daniel said he thought it had a chance, not because it was perfect, but because it was built on respect rather than dominance. The shuttle launched, carrying them back to the diplomatic quarter, and outside the viewport, ships from dozens of species moved through space, with human vessels trading beside Korathi merchants and Vrex military ships training with human Essis, destroyers and independent freighters, carrying goods between systems that barely communicated before. A year ago, the galaxy teetered on the brink of catastrophic war, and today, it was discovering what real cooperation could look like when based on mutual respect rather than imposed hierarchy. In the Korathi Fleet Command, Zorith reviewed reports with his staff about the joint patrol with human forces and noted their tactical coordination was impressive, and his second asked if they would maintain the alliance, and Zorith said for now, yes, but more importantly, they had learned that the path to respect was not through submission or conquest, but through standing firm while remaining open to cooperation. In the Vrex Union, Chairman Vex Prime celebrated the first anniversary of their alliance with humanity, saying they were no longer subjects of anyone but partners with equals, and this was what true independence looked like. On Earth, Admiral Christine stood down the most aggressive contingency operations while maintaining defensive readiness because humanity would never again be unprepared, but the immediate crisis had passed. The galaxy learned a crucial lesson that free species do not kneel, but will work together when treated with respect. And humanity reminded everyone of that truth, not through conquest or submission, but by being willing to stand alone rather than accept chains. The Galactic Council still existed but was fundamentally changed and was no longer an empire in everything but name, but what it should have been all along, which was a forum for cooperation between sovereign equals. It all started with a delegation walking out of a chamber and a captain refusing to back down from a blockade, and sometimes, the most powerful weapon was not technology or numbers, but simply the courage to say no and mean it. The galaxy was still learning that lesson, but humanity had taught it well, and in the decades that followed, historians would debate whether human defiance prevented war or nearly caused it. But the truth was more complex, because humanity created a moment of crisis that forced every species to choose what kind of galaxy they wanted. Most chose cooperation over domination, and that made all the difference, and the Council would never be the same. But more importantly, the galaxy would never look at itself the same way either. Daniel sat on his home colony watching the sunset with his family, and allowed himself to finally relax because they had done it, and humanity earned its place among the stars, not as subjects or conquerors, but as equals. And that was worth every risk they took.